Welcome to ODI. Welcome to this very exciting event that I'm sure a number of you have seen some noise of on social media and elsewhere. Let me introduce myself. My name is Marta. I'm one of the managing directors here at ODI, and together with colleagues, I've been one of the initiator and sort of architect of our sort of collective work on migration and displacement. And it's a pleasure to be here sort of 2 years since we first decided to make this such a central priority for ODI and share our thinking with you and have colleagues around us for this important event. We are convening this event today because there is increasingly an important discussion taking place out in the world about jobs and refugees, and about the fact that we need to think differently about displacement, about ways of addressing the problems, and we're going to debate today the extent to which jobs are indeed part of the answer, and if so, how. We're going to cover a range of different topics. I'm going to try to handle this as a debate, so I'm going to get my guests to speak to one another. I'm going to bring you in at different points to hear your views. It is a public event. It's streamed online. My welcome to everybody who's following online. You're all very welcome to tweet using the hashtag #JobsForRefugees. And I think the speakers' Twitter handles are on the screen, so you can also reference to them. I will be taking questions from those of you who are following online. And I hope that you will all have an interesting time today. And after the event, I think you can all join us for a glass of wine, I hope. That's what, if I remember. Good. Okay, so let me introduce our first speaker, and then we'll move on to others. Our first speaker is Alex Betts, who is a Leopold Müller Professor of Forced Migration and International Affairs and a Fellow of the Green Temple College at the University of Oxford. And of course, Alex, many of you will know him, has been a scholar and a very sort of, has been increasingly a public speaker in the last few years on matters of displacement and refugees in the UK and internationally. And of course, he's one of the authors of an important new, bold book that says that we need some new thinking and that there is some urgency around it, co-authored with his colleague, Sir and Professor Paul Collier. And the book is called Refuge, as I'm sure a number of you know. So welcome, Alex. Can I ask you to help us set the scene for this debate today by telling us a little bit more what's wrong with international regime and international systems to date? The book that you and Paul authored says that is broken and needs fixing. And then why, as part of this fixing, we need to think a lot more carefully and seriously about jobs.
Thank you. Thank you, Marta. Thank you, ODI. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Heaven. And thank you, Manjula, for setting up this opportunity to speak to a really important topic. It's worth keeping in mind at the start of this debate that Heaven is one person who's been a great critique of refuge. And I think it's fair to say, Heaven, that you've probably written by far the most critical review I've read of the book. But I regard it to be thoughtful, serious, and that debate on issues that affects people's lives is really necessary and important, and it should be robust and considered. So I'm really grateful that we've got this opportunity. So I think the starting point, the starting context for this discussion needs to be the recognition that the refugee challenge is a geographically concentrated challenge. Nearly 90% of the world's refugees are in developing regions of the world, broadly conceived. Now, that's a UNHCR statistic one can question. Is Turkey really a developing country? Probably not. But if we take a definition that is developing regions, the geographical challenge is predominantly in those parts of the world. Just 10 countries host nearly 60% of the world's refugees. Now, in an ideal world, one might imagine that we could geographically relocate people on a much more just basis, that it doesn't work to have millions of people sitting in a country like Lebanon or a country like Turkey not being relocated and resettled. But the question is, given that resettlement has consistently been around 1% of the world's refugees, is that a realistic policy option? Similarly, is it a realistic policy option to expect many of those people to go home tomorrow? Probably not, given that conflicts often endure, fragile states endure, and the world is very bad at putting weak governments back together. Similarly, is it a realistic option to expect people to get permanent pathways to citizenship in those host countries that are struggling in the short term? Probably not. So we're in a very constrained environment about how we respond to those populations of refugees. But at the moment, they face an impossible choice, effectively, between three options. If, for instance, you're a family fleeing Syria, your choices are limited basically to the following. Firstly, encampment. You can go to a refugee camp in a country like Jordan, to a camp like Zaatari or a camp like Azraq, where your right to work will be extremely limited, your formal right to engage with markets will be limited, and you will have assistance, but not much else. Camp life is miserable. And yet encampment is the dominant default response of the humanitarian community around the world. In the Dadaab refugee camps, home to around 350,000 people, 100,000 refugees have been born in the Dadaab camps. For those in protracted refugee situations who have been in exile for more than 5 years, UNHCR says the average length of stay is 26 years. So encampment is an option that refugees themselves are increasingly rejecting. The second option on the table is effectively urban destitution. More than half of the world's refugees are now in urban areas. And the challenge is that the international system struggles to provide assistance. In Turkey, for instance, where most refugees are in urban areas, around 10% of refugees receive formal assistance through the international system and its implementing partners. So inevitably, once refugees deplete savings, unless they can rely on their own networks, we end up with situations of urban destitution with the double whammy of limited rights to work, de facto and de jure limitations on that right to work, and yet limited assistance. And that leaves the third impossible choice of embarking on perilous journeys. And we saw, particularly since October 2014, as the situation deteriorated in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey simultaneously, more people crossing the Aegean Sea, crossing the Mediterranean, coming to Europe, and political space decreasing as populist nationalism rose in correlation with the number of migrants and refugees coming into Europe. So we face real constraints. This isn't an easy situation. What is the answer? There is no one answer. Jobs are not the solution. But a refugee system, as a refugee system, should be doing three broad things. Firstly, offering rescue to people in terms of meeting their basic needs: food, clothing, shelter, non-refoulement. But it has to do more than that. Secondly, it has to provide autonomy, the chance to restore people's lives to normality as quickly as possible. And one key way in which we can do that is jobs. Jobs matter because they create opportunities for self-reliance. They tap into people's skills, talents, aspirations, their ability to contribute. In the research we've done, particularly in East Africa, one of the main things refugees have said they want is jobs, access to markets, the chance to support themselves and their family, not only because it empowers them economically, but because it's a core part of human dignity. The third thing a refugee system has to do, though, is provide a route out of limbo. It may be reasonable to expect people to wait in a neighbouring country for 3 years, maybe even 5 years. 10 years is definitely unreasonable. And so the rest of the world has obligations that they have to fulfill to use resettlement wisely. For the most vulnerable, yes, but also beyond a cutoff to get people out of those situations. But in the interim, jobs can help with self-reliance, can help with sustainability, and can tap into the talents of people. How should we do that? It's context specific. There's no one solution that's going to work in every host country around the world. It has to work with the politics of that country and shift the political economy, working with gatekeepers, pushing the needle, and opening up socioeconomic rights. In Central America, in the 1990s, the Yucatan Peninsula, a relatively underdeveloped area, developed through providing self-reliance opportunities to Guatemalan refugees. Through self-reliance, local integration, Mexico benefited, refugees benefited, it contributed to area development. In a long-standing study that we've done in Uganda, with qualitative and quantitative research methods, working with refugees as refugee research assistants, we've documented the success of Uganda's relatively unique model. It provides refugees the right to work. It provides them a relative degree of freedom of movement. It's a country that's not perfect for many other reasons, but the data we've collected shows that refugees benefit massively from that model, and the host community benefits. To give you one statistic, in Kampala, 21% of refugees run a business that employs at least one other person, and of those they employ, 40% are nationals of the host state. In other countries, it's much more difficult to create the Uganda model. Jordan is an example of a challenging country. It faces, like many host countries, a real security challenge and a development challenge. The question is how, in that limited, constrained political environment, can we shift the politics to create jobs? One idea at pilot stage that I've been involved in is the idea that's led to the Jordan Compact, of using pre-existing special economic zones to create jobs for refugees alongside host nationals. I've said in many places it's a second best solution. It's a pilot that is underway. Through commitments from the European Union to provide a trade carve-out in particular areas like garments, through concessional finance from the World Bank, through bilateral aid from the British government and others, a government previously unprepared to break down de facto barriers to the right to work has committed to provide 200,000 jobs to Syrian refugees over 5 years. It may not achieve that, but it's given 40,000 permits over the first year of the project. There are big challenges to it. For instance, many of those permits have been applied to people who previously held jobs in the informal sector and simply formalised those jobs. To create 200,000 jobs would require levels of investment by businesses and investors that don't currently exist. But nevertheless, what it's done is put an innovative pilot on the table that we can learn from, look at, think creatively about, and it's tried to engage with a difficult, challenging political situation in the context of a lot of constraints to try and change the political model and explore what economic models can bring autonomy and dignity to refugees in those host countries in the developing world.
Thank you, Alex. And we'll come back a little bit later to talk a little bit more about the experience of Jordan and, as Alex said, the realities of particular, political economy and the realities of markets and local economies in different contexts, and what these solutions and these propositions could look like in different places, as well as a bit more of an evaluation of how successful some of these pilots are. But before we get into that level of detail, let me turn to Heaven. Heaven is a senior research associate here at ODI. She's also professor of international migration at Coventry University, Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations, where she's been working for the last few years on a number of projects, and I think is one of the scholars that has the most in-depth experience of doing empirical research with in-depth interviews on very large numbers of migrants and refugees in different parts of the world. So can I ask you, Heaven, to reflect on sort of Alex's proposition, both about what doesn't quite work and what direction should we look for from the solution, drawing in particular on your research and others about the realities of people on the move and their preferences, their desire, their opportunities and limitations.
Sure. Thank you, and thanks again for the opportunity. Like Alex, I'm really grateful for a chance to talk about these things. I think it's one thing having a Twitter spat. It's quite another actually getting in a room with a bunch of people and going into some of the detail in terms of the jobs and employment, which we'll talk about, I think, in the second session, but also about the kind of broader political and policy discourse within which we're engaged. And I suppose that was the starting point of my critique, essentially, was that I think the political and policy solutions, if you like, depend on how you characterise the problem in part. So I've taken issue, as you'll know, potentially with some of the characterisation of the problem in the book. And I think one of the problems is that it kind of reflects and reinforces the language of crisis that has come to dominate a lot of the discussion in the context within which we're located. So I think starting with the problem of refugees coming to Europe is slightly problematic because, yes, there has been a recent increase, but in reality it remains the case that the vast majority of refugees are, as you rightly say, Alex, located elsewhere, and they've been making very perilous journeys for decades. So the fact that we in Europe are suddenly coming into contact with that doesn't mean that it's suddenly an issue. I think the other issue that I want to address is the fact that in reality only a very small proportion of the world's refugee population actually live in camps, around 20% more or less, and only 1 in 10 of Syrian refugees. So we need to be very careful that we don't presuppose that camp life is the dominant situation, because in reality it's not. And certainly there's a problem of urban destitution, but I think there's also an issue of many communities being integrated more effectively than that statistic might suggest. And I think the third thing that's really important to put on the table, because the book is very critical of UNHCR and others, is that the importance of refugee employment has been long recognised and has been on the table for a very long time, not only in the Refugee Convention, which talks about the need for gainful employment in Articles 17, 18 and 19, but also by UNHCR, who from the late 60s onwards, but particularly through the Refugee and Development Programme of the 80s refugees and then their urban refugees and alternatives to camps policies have been and are doing things in that area. It may not always be perfect, it may not always deliver what we want, but it would be a misrepresentation to suggest that UNHCR has not tried to engage in that work. The second issue, I suppose, so that's the characterization issue that I wanted to engage with. The second issue, and I really appreciate, Alex, you saying that that there isn't one solution and that SEZs, the special economic zones in Jordan, are not necessarily intended to be the kind of big answer to everything. But I think they are very much put to the foreground in the book, and that's probably fair representation or characterization. And it's really important that what is going on in Jordan and elsewhere is really explored as being a potential model for other places. But I think the truth is that what's been happening in Jordan is a consequence of a political and economic alliance and allegiance of interest between Europe and Jordan. And it's actually very particular. I think if you look at the vast majority of contexts where refugees are located in very long-standing, protracted situations, that kind of harnessing of the benefits of globalization, which is a characteristic of refugees' sort of thesis, is hard to imagine. In Iran, where you have 1.5 million Afghans and we have economic sanctions, I can't consider or conceive of that being an option. In Bangladesh, where the Rohingya are currently in the process of being put on an island to get them out of the general context, I can't see that being an option. In Ethiopia, yes, there are efforts, but from the conversations we've had in Ethiopia, those jobs that are being allocated to refugees are causing all sorts of local hostility and problems because the local population, who is also very poor and marginalised, feels that the Eritreans in particular, who they've been in conflict with for a very long time, should not be being prioritised in that way. And you mentioned Uganda, which I think is a really interesting example, and I think it is doing some really interesting things. But I think the reality is that Uganda itself, like many of these contexts, is suffering from very low and slow economic growth. Its rural areas are incredibly poor, and the vast majority of the people who are moving there from South Sudan are women and children. So jobs is not really what we need. We need really good education and health provision, if nothing else, and then what else comes out of it. So I think by way of kind of taking this to the next part of the discussion, I wanted to sort of address this issue. If jobs are not the way forward, what is? How do we mend this broken refugee system? And I would say, based on our experience of interviewing 500 refugees and migrants who crossed the Mediterranean in 2015, that there are two main things that we need to be doing, and they're really tough, and no one wants to talk about them, but I think we should. The first is we need to address the factors that force people to move from their homes in the first place. So conflict, persecution, human rights abuse. So we can call this the root causes or whatever kind of language you want to use. But ultimately, it means governments not selling arms to countries that attack their own populations and then being surprised when they leave. It means leveraging the very significant economic resources that the European Union and others have to force countries and governments to behave differently, the Khartoum process being a very obvious example of that, and centering peace and human rights at the centre of our discussions about refugees. The second thing that we need to do, and it's intrinsically connected, is to talk about rights. Because in order to address the needs of refugees in terms of the things that Alex is rightly talking about, their lack of a sense of the future, their lack of hope, and therefore their feeling that they have no alternative other than to move on, you have to provide them with some sort of security. That doesn't necessarily mean citizenship, but it does mean a context within which they have a sense of the future. And I would say that the problem is not UNHCR, nor the international framework, but the willingness of states to actually do what they are signed up to. They, in particular, in some of the contexts that we've been talking to people in, and that would include Jordan, but also Lebanon and Turkey, people were talking about the issues around low-paid, unregulated labour as being a problem. But what they were talking about as being more of a problem was the fact that there was no sense that this would ever change or ever end. And even though they had the opportunity to work, potentially, albeit in these low-paid jobs, it wasn't enough. What they wanted was a sense that they and their children could be protected and have a future. So I think if you look at some of the situations that we're talking about, Afghans in Iran, Ghanaians, Nigerians, Senegalese in Libya, if you look at Eritreans who believe they'll be deported from Sudan, they're moving on, not per se because they don't have jobs, but because they're not safe or they don't feel they can be safe.
Okay. thank you, Heaven. I think you'll agree with me that Heaven and Alex have both sort of set the scene with, both sort of different perspectives, but also a number of areas I'm sure we can discuss further and find, much alignment to. But both issues around the fact that, the problem can be characterized in different ways, and the space for solutions accordingly can have a number of different trajectories. But before we get into that discussion, I want my next two speakers to help us to put a little bit of flesh on the bone on these questions about jobs as part of the solution. So my next speaker is Manjula Luthria, who's connected from Washington, from the World Bank. Manjula is a global focal point on migration in the labor and jobs and social protection global practice at the bank. And has been working on labour mobility issues for many years. And that's precisely the reason why I asked her to come and join us on this panel, because I'd love to hear from her experience across the globe in a number of different economies and labour markets, what her initial reactions are to, Alex's propositions about why and how jobs can be an important part of the solution, and the extent to which you agree with Heaven about the fact that other avenues are as important. Manjula.
Thank you, Martha. Hello, hello, Alex. Hello, Heaven. And I suspect you have an audience full, a room full of
We do.
an audience which I don't see, but hello to them as well. Look, I mean, both speakers, Alex and Heaven, I think painted an incredibly accurate picture of the challenges that the system faces today and the situation as it exists today. Perhaps no other time has actually begged for innovation in this space like now. Yeah. For those of us that have worked on, Marta kindly said in her introduction, for those of us that have been working on labor mobility issues more broadly for a very long time, have already become considerably overwhelmed, no matter what our data and numbers show about the benefits of labor mobility. We're already quite stumped and overwhelmed with the level of short-sightedness, right, in policymaking and institution building that exists right now on this issue. Now, I want to make a distinction, though, between migrants and refugees. They're different. They're a very different set of populations. There are times when their needs overlap. There's no question. Certainly, their reasons for leaving and how soon and what the volumes are of the exit are absolutely very, very different. Right? So they leave for different reasons. They leave in a very different time span, and then the concentrations of people leaving and therefore arriving somewhere else are also very different. But they are in search of the same thing. They are in search of dignity. They are in search of well-being. They're certainly in search of a better life for themselves, but even more so for their families. And so it's hard to argue against the fact that all of this, what that they seek, is actually really dependent on their ability to actually get a job. Right? There's no question that their labor market insertion is at the heart of them actually being able to get a better life for their families. Now, what do we know, zooming out in the experience of broader sort of labor mobility success stories? And yes, I think Alex said it, and I think Heaven also echoed the same thought. Context matters, right? So first of all, scale matters, and this is why the whole refugee story looks very different from the migration story. I know we're going to talk about Jordan in a little while, but nowhere perhaps is the issue of scale more evident than the refugee population in Lebanon. Right? So 1/3 of the population is now refugees. So 1.5 million or so in a population of 3 million and so, right? In terms of the numbers, that's mind-boggling and somewhat incomprehensible, perhaps, for Europeans to think of that scale at all, right? I think someone did math quickly and said it was like about 21 million Europeans moving quickly and suddenly to the UK. So get your head wrapped around that. That's mind-boggling. So scale matters when it comes to actually even offering any semblance of a strategy for labor market absorption. Perhaps everything that we've said in the past about good policies and institutions for labor market absorption of migrants comes to a embarrassing and staggering halt when you look at the scale, such as you have to in the case of Lebanon. Now, the pre-existing situation matters as well. We know about sort of the aging issues, the demographic issues in Europe and certain parts of East Asia. And we know that there are parts of the world that have severe labor shortages now and will have even bigger labor shortages in the near future. We know throw into that mix issue of automation, right? This is forcing countries to actually start looking at both their macro policies as well as their labor market policies much more carefully, because the challenge of creating good quality jobs seems to be now pretty much a global worry. So throw into that then the issue of, again, to take the example of Lebanon, where Lebanon needed to create something like 6 times the amount of jobs even before the Syrians arrived, just for its own people, right? Now, similarly, Pakistan, which is a very large hosting country to a population of Afghan refugees, has had a job creation challenge in Pakistan for Pakistanis, right? So that's a bit different from what we might look at in, say, Germany. Right? Germany is losing workers, doesn't have to imagine a future of labor shortages. It knows that reality already, right? There are other places in the globe as well, Japan, yes, Korea as well. So very few countries are actually already at that stage of desperately needing labor at all skill levels. And most are actually at the stage of having to relook and double up their efforts on job creation. And as Alex said a little while ago, many of these are actually hosting refugee populations, so and the burden of which comes on top of the burden they were already struggling with. Okay. Now, within countries as well, spatial mismatches matter. So aggregate statistics can conceal a lot. So the hubs of economic activity within a country may not be where the refugee populations are right now. And so integrating them into the labor market is not simply a case of them filling labor shortages where natives perhaps are less interested in doing the work, or where they could become complementary to natives labor market. They're very often in places where integrating them into the labor market means integrating them into an agricultural value chain. Yeah? Incredibly difficult for the host country even before refugees arrived. Right? So the spatial mismatch within countries matters a whole lot.
Okay.
Manjula, service delivery matters.
1 minute. Can you just come to a conclusion? I want to move on and then also have a bit of a discussion about this. Thanks.
Yeah. I wanted also to say though that service delivery matters a lot. It's not about the labor market. Health and education service delivery matters a lot, and this seems to have a huge impact in how both labor migrants as well as refugees are able to access these services and then move on to actually accessing a labor market. I wanted to then maybe end with sort of two examples. One of Canada, one of Australia, right? Just to really go across the globe. Canada, for example, has a vastly different outcomes on labor market absorption of refugees who've arrived through the government-sponsored scheme, and Canada being unique in that it also offers a privately sponsored refugee scheme. When you compare these two, 10% of those are working have arrived through government-sponsored schemes, and about 50% of them are working amongst the ones that have arrived through privately sponsored schemes. So labor market outcomes seem to matter a whole lot in Canada, depending on which modality was used. Finally, just quick it's something that I've often used as a sort of ray of hope in all this. Australian refugees, their economic outcomes, their labor market outcomes seem to outstrip natives' outcomes in just a few years. So there is something about state capacity to provide services on arrival and then integrate into labor markets that can be done well. And we don't know exactly what Australia does well. Maybe somebody else in the room might, but it serves as a point of light. I'm out of time.
Thank
Stop
you.
here for now.
We'll come back to you, Manjula, in a minute. Get into some examples from different countries. But thank you for both reminding us about some of the conditions and the realities that make labor integration successful. I think scale and the mismatch that might exist in some of the countries that are host countries of a large number of refugees. And the fact that while jobs lead to better life and has a lot of potential, there is a lot else that needs to happen for that to become a reality. Let me come, before I open the discussion to a few more of you, to Sayer Nais. Sayer is the executive director of a very interesting organization called Talent Beyond Boundaries, which is based in the US, in Washington, who is running some innovative pilot work, trying to open safe and legal pathways to help refugees find international employment through labor. So trying to actually make some of these employment opportunities a reality, focusing at the moment, I think, in some of the countries that we touched upon, so refugees that are currently in Jordan and Lebanon. Sarah herself has worked for UNHCR in the past in the Middle East, so also brings that perspective and that experience. Sarah, one thing I'm very curious about, based on your experience of working with employers and with refugees themselves, what do they actually need and want when it comes to employment? What is the demand, what's the supply, how well matched it is?
Thanks for having me on this panel. And here I am coming from Washington, D.C., and I should note that part of our work, we're not at all trying to place refugees in Washington, D.C. or in the U.S. at all right now, unfortunately, but there are many other parts of the world we're looking at. So as Marta mentioned, Talent Beyond Boundaries was formed to help open up a new labor mobility pathway for refugees. And we've started our pilot project working with any refugee living in Lebanon and Jordan who cannot work there legally, and looking at companies and countries in different parts of the world that need skilled labor and have the right immigration pathways that would work for this population and, of course, would afford refugees protection. Of course, you all would know that there are many skilled professional refugees in different parts of the world. And through the course of our work, we now have reached out across communities in both Lebanon and Jordan and have met, accountants and healthcare professionals and judges and engineers and many others. And at the same time, we've been talking with companies, multinationals, small and medium enterprises, trade and industry associations. They tell us about the need to find talent. They are trying to fill jobs, and they want to retain that talent. There was a Manpower Group survey, I think the last year's one, found that globally, 40% of employers have a hard time finding the talent they need to fill jobs. So of course there's this mismatch in terms of labor supply and demand. So we're trying to take a very practical approach to addressing that, while also helping refugees, regain their self-reliance and dignity. So I'm just going to share a few key points or lessons we've learned throughout starting this pilot. There are many different things I could discuss. As you would all imagine, this does not come without a ton of various challenges, from policy questions to practical realities of what it is to be a refugee and you might not have all of your documentation. But 3 things we are learning. It's data, refugee protection, and partnerships. For data, when we started talking with companies, many of them said, okay, that's interesting. We'd love to help be part of this a global solution for refugees, and we could do this as maybe a CSR project, but that would be for a very small number. So for this to scale, we are interested in doing this and helping out, but we also need to find the talent that really meets our needs. So it's a good fit for both the refugee and the employer. So they said, we need more data. Of course, UNHCR and many others have tons of data on refugees, but what the companies needed was very granular, all the details on work experience, educational background, language abilities, various skill sets. So we built an online platform that we're calling a talent catalog, where refugees can share that information using their smartphones. We have volunteers going out across communities with tablets, and it basically creates a CV, which then we will share without the identifying information, but with interested corporations and say, hey, if you are interested in engineers, we have about, I think, 365 engineers in our talent pool. Look through these. Are these of interest to you? And so far, what we've found is that the companies are finding that there are refugees in our talent pool, at least, who they would be interested in considering for hiring. So now this was initially, kind of a hidden talent pool. Companies weren't considering how to hire refugees from overseas because it sounded complicated and they didn't have enough detail. But now, once shown the talent, they've expressed a lot of interest. Secondly, this is obvious, but a key point. Refugee protection must be maintained. Talent Beyond Boundaries, we are cooperating with the UNHCR very closely. We have a cooperation agreement on this pilot. And as you all know, there's been commitments made, including at the summit last year in the New York Declaration, to explore complementary pathways for refugees, including labor mobility. So, of course, that is key, and we're relying on protection experts to work with us. And also, these countries that they would go to would have to afford refugees protection, sign the 1951 Convention, etc. Countries, couldn't put we can't put refugees at risk of refoulement. And also, another point on this is complementary pathways cannot replace traditional paths like resettlement, which is for the most vulnerable. This is not a replacement or an alternative. This is giving people an additional option to move for safety, but also economic opportunities. Finally, partnerships are, of course, key to this effort. We need to work closely with the refugees themselves through every step of the process, with trusted corporate partners, with governments. Even though we're looking at moving people on skilled worker visas, sometimes the governments will have to be a bit flexible about their policies. And but so far, we've heard promising interest from the Canadians, not surprisingly, Australians. We're also looking at, I don't think this can only be limited to developed countries. We're also exploring, we've started to look at Morocco as a potential, and that comes with its own challenges. But for this to scale, we need to look at middle-income countries as well.
Thank you, Sarah. Can I stop you there so we can get some sort of opinions from the public and then go back for a second round where we can dig a little bit deeper. So I think we've heard sort of the two propositions with a lot of overlap, but also some, different emphasis both on what the problem is and why it needs, a radical or new solution, but also some caveats around it on the nature of the problem and the fact that, there are risks with the solution being too focused on jobs alone. But then as part of that, it was helpful to get from Manjula and Sarah, I think, a bit of perspective about, when it can be done well and what needs to be some of the key features of that response.